Hello, good afternoon, and welcome here to the Prog Monster. My name is Murph. I am the host of this channel. We're here today to do an episode of the mini-series we have been running for a couple months now called The Monsters of the 70s. This will be the 9th episode, one more to go. And we're going to be featuring this band, Led Zeppelin. Yep, we're going to be talking some Zepp today. The last episode we will talk about before I end this episode. So the first thing about Led Zeppelin is Led Zeppelin was formed in the 1960s. Now, back then they were just a new band. That's what we considered them. But nowadays people being a lot more technical and being more questioning on everything, people actually see this as a super band. And I don't really see it that way, but if that's what you want to call it, you're welcome to do so. So Led Zeppelin was formed out of the remnants of a band called the Yardbirds. Jimmy Page being the member of that band that transcended over to form Led Zeppelin. Originally, they had tried a few other musicians, including both John Entwistle and drummer Keith Moon of The Who, and they were the ones that kind of coined the phrase, this is going to go down like a Zeppelin or a Led Zeppelin. And so eventually that name stuck with the band. But when they first formed, I guess what happened was that Jimmy Page knew John Paul Jones from his session work. And I guess somebody introduced Robert Plant to him. And then, of course, Robert Plant brought his drummer from his band into Zeppelin as well, and that was John Bonham. So Zeppelin's one of those few bands, they've only had the original members. There's not very many, none of the large bands, like none of the most iconic bands that I can think of, had the same members from beginning to end other than the Beatles. And even the Beatles had some different people in their band at the beginning before they started producing albums. But yeah, Zeppelin for me. So that's a little bit about their history before they started releasing albums. So they released 2 albums in the 60s, their first debut album and then their second, Led Zeppelin 2. I chose to place Zeppelin in the 70s series because the bulk of their influence came from the 1970s albums and the touring, making them arguably the largest band in the world at that time in the 70s. They were kind of to the 70s what the Beatles were to the 60s. I've taken some heat for saying I think they're bigger than the Beatles. As far as sales go, they don't compete. There's a number of reasons for that, I think, but it doesn't really matter. The Beatles have sold twice as many albums of them, and you will not convince Beatle fans otherwise. However, definitely when I was growing up, this was the band. This was the largest band. We all viewed these guys as the big band. Some people were more on the Stones, and then, of course, Kiss came, and for a few years there, Kiss was at the top of the pyramid. But overall, I think Zeppelin is the band. And also, in hindsight, the stuff that you knew in the 70s has been kind of filtered down over another 4 decades, and so people see this through a different lens than they did back then, and I'll give them credit for that fully. So that's kind of the general history of the band up until John Bonham's death. They had some issues, of course, like so many rock bands in the 70s. Robert Plant's son dying, Jimmy Page's alcohol abuse, all those things, of course, contributed to some of the downward spiraling of the band in the late 70s. I don't think they spiraled out of control, though many bands were doing the same thing as them. But still, that's kind of the general history of the band. They had the number of studio albums they had was 8. If you want to count Coda in there, you can, but Coda is kind of a mishmash of different eras of songs that were never released and put onto an album and then released as a Zeppelin because people were starving for Zeppelin, I guess. You can include that, I guess, as a studio album as well, since there was no original material. All the material on it was original, had not been released before. Biggest album, I don't think there's any doubt that this is their magnus opus. Now, when I was growing up, this was Led Zeppelin 4. I never thought about it as it being anything else. Yeah, you got the odd person out there, those guys who like to be technical about everything and said this was the Zoso album. And you'll even see that Zoso stuff is printed here on the side of this particular album. But I never thought of it as a Zoso album. That was news to me until, maybe in the last couple decades it's been called that more often. Or the other word you will hear to describe this album is the untitled Led Zeppelin album. But for the vast majority of us who grew up with this album, this was Led Zeppelin 4. And that's how I'm going to refer to it for the rest of this time we're on here. A massive album selling 27 million initially, I believe, and I think it's now closer to or over 30 million albums. Anyways, big, huge album, but not my favorite album. Surprisingly, some people would think it would be, but this is my favorite, Led Zeppelin 3, which is kind of a bit of an outlier in the Zeppelin discography. Not so much heavy stuff going on here. A little bit more folky, a little bit more bluesy, some different sounds going on here. But I like this album. I think it's a great album and currently is my favorite. So this is Led Zeppelin 3. Of course, it does have the Immigrant song here, which is one of the songs people often quote as being the kind of coining the phrase heavy metal, coming from this album. Anyways, really good. This is my favorite, and Led Zeppelin 4 is, to me, the biggest. Notable things that happened to Zeppelin, of course, they were honored into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame back in 1995, and I think they did the Kennedy Induction Center Awards, and I want to say that was in 2013, but it might have been in 2007. I'm not really sure, but they did have Kennedy honors back then, Led Zeppelin. It's probably likely in the earlier phrase because I do remember Obama being present for that ceremony, so I'm thinking it was during his presidency. My personal, the members of Led Zeppelin, of course, John Paul Jones, John Bonham, Jimmy Page, and Robert Plant. Those are the members of Led Zeppelin. And then my history with them goes back to probably, I think the first time I heard the phrase Led Zeppelin was probably in my classroom back in 1976 when I was in grade 6 at the time. Being a huge Kiss fan at that point in time, that's all I wanted to talk about. But there was a couple guys in my class saying, their Kiss couldn't even hold Led Zeppelin shoes. And I remember being angry at that phrase. And consequently, I had a bit of a negative impact with Led Zeppelin at the time. But I kind of gotten over it over the years. The band grew on me, and my perspective on this band is that it was the largest band from the 1970s. And I actually view it as the biggest band in history, and I know I will take some heat for that. People always want to argue the point, but that's okay. Everybody's entitled to their view, their own history view on a band. You can believe whatever you want. There's people out there that believe U2 is the greatest band of all time, and I think those people need some help, but that's not I'm not going to go there. Anyways, so my history of Zeppelin kind of grew over the 70s. not really taking any kind of form until sometime in the 80s when I started getting into this idea that who is my favorite and who are my 5 favorite, and then who's in my list after that. Because a couple of people say, oh, who are your 10 favorite bands, and I would have to come up with them. And Zeppelin was always in amongst them, but they were never part of my elite band group. So early on, it was my favorite. My top 5 were my elite, and gradually over time, I've added to that. So it's now up to, I have 11 bands in my elite, and Led Zeppelin is still not in there. They could make it, but it's been a long time being in that second group of bands, so maybe they're destined to stay there. But I do recognize their immense talent and their contributions to a lot of the genres that I like: metal, even hard rock, some blues, even some proggy stuff here too, and even some of that Indian sound. So to me, that's my history with Led Zeppelin. So overall, I think this is one of the great bands. First, second, third, or 10th, who knows? Definitely one of the greatest rock bands in history. 2 of their best albums. They got lots of good ones. I think, if I remember correctly, they had 6 number 1s in the U.S. for albums and 8 number 1s in the U.K. So all of their studio albums were number 1 in the U.K. That's a pretty staggering assessment of a band. Anyways, that's my take today. Band number 9 on the monsters of the 1970s is Led Zeppelin. So we will be back with the final episode of this series next week, which will feature Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. I know that some people will now say, well, what happened to AC/DC and what happened to Genesis? Like, they were sure that Genesis and AC/DC would be in this list. Okay, so here's my issue with both of these bands. Have kind of the same issue. Their biggest selling time and their most popular period was in the 80s. However, when you look back over the history of these bands, I believe their best music for both these bands was in the 70s. At least that's my opinion, and those are my favorite albums from both AC/DC and Genesis come from the 1970s. But they weren't that big in the 1970s. Neither of these bands were among the top 10 biggest bands in the 1970s. However, going forward into the 80s, both these bands exploded and became among the most popular bands out there. So I had to decide whether I should put them in because my favorite music was in the 70s, or when I think they were the biggest bands, which was in the 80s. And I decided not to include them in the 70s for that reason. So if you're upset with my excluding them from my monsters of the 70s, I apologize, but that's my explanation for it. Anyways, we will be back with Emerson, Lake, and Palmer next week. Not a band that I overly love, but a band that hugely influenced the music that I love, the pop, the prog. These guys were the excess of prog, and we're going to talk about them next week. Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please hit the like and subscribe. If you want to make any comments or add your own 2 cents worth in the comment section, you're more than likely or more than welcome to do so. So I will see you all next week for Monsters of the 70s. Take care. Have yourself a good evening, and goodbye here from the Prog Monster.